Over the grey, wind-whipped waters of the English Channel, the first light of dawn struggled to cut through drifting layers of mist. Below, the sea was scattered with the silhouettes of ships, destroyers, trawlers, ferries, pleasure craft, and lifeboats, fighting their way toward the burning shores of Dunkirk. Above them, the sky trembled with the distant rumble of engines. Luftwaffe aircraft were forming up for the day's assault, confident, experienced, and certain of air supremacy. And rising beneath them came a formation of RAF fighters that the Germans did not yet understand, sleek, dark, and strangely engineered, their silhouettes lacking the familiar glint of forward-facing guns. They were Defiants, the aircraft many in the RAF had quietly dismissed as an evolutionary dead end, a machine unsuited for dogfighting, slow in the climb, and awkward in its concept. Yet on that morning, something unexpected was about to happen. The Defiant had never been meant to fight like a Spitfire or Hurricane. Its entire design revolved around a rotating four-gun turret placed behind the pilot, a bold attempt to revive the First World War concept of a turret fighter, an aircraft that would let a gunner track targets independently while the pilot focused on flying. But between the wars, aviation advanced too quickly, and by the late 1930s few believed the idea had a future. Monoplane fighters were sharper. Battles in Spain had shown that speed and agility were everything. Yet Britain, juggling limited budgets, competing design philosophies, and urgent rearmament, allowed the Defiant to proceed, partly because no one could yet predict exactly what kind of air war the nation was about to face. When it entered service in 1939, the Defiant was greeted with quiet by many RAF fighter pilots. Its lack of forward-firing guns seemed to mark it as obsolete before it even reached operational units. Test pilots noted its tendency to lose energy in climbing turns, and its single Merlin engine struggled to compensate for the weight of the electric turret and its ammunition. The plane was neither particularly fast nor particularly. It was a compromise, a machine built around an idea that had already passed its era. But as war erupted across Europe, the RAF needed aircraft, any aircraft, and the Defiant squadrons trained relentlessly, their pilots learning to coordinate with their gunners in a way no other fighter crews needed to do. It was this unusual partnership, pilot and turret gunner acting in perfect synchronization, that would soon catch the Luftwaffe by surprise. German pilots, accustomed to the fixed-gun fighters of the RAF, had been trained to attack from behind and above, the classic strike position that had brought them countless victories over slower or unsuspecting opponents. When they spotted Defiants for the first time, their assumptions locked into place. These must be Hurricanes or some variant of them, and they would die just as easily. But the Luftwaffe had misread the silhouette. The long, smooth fuselage of the Defiant made it appear unarmed from the front, and from most angles its turret was difficult to see, an illusion the RAF would exploit brutally in the months ahead. By late May 1940, the German advance across Belgium and France had triggered the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the Luftwaffe was determined to crush it from the air. RAF Fighter Command scrambled everything it had: Spitfires, Hurricanes, and almost as an afterthought, the Defiants. On the morning of the 29th, as Luftwaffe formations crossed the coast, a flight of Defiants from No. 264 Squadron climbed into position, their crews tense but disciplined. They were flying into a battle that would define their aircraft's place in history. As German fighters swept toward them, the Defiant pilots held their course. Radar plots had warned of incoming raids, but the scale and intensity of the Luftwaffe presence could never be fully conveyed through instruments alone. Each Defiant pilot concentrated on keeping formation, maintaining altitude, and positioning the aircraft to give the turret gunners a stable firing platform. Behind them, the gunners rotated their turrets to scanning arcs, searching for the shapes that would emerge from the haze. The Germans approached swiftly, 109s and 110s, their wings flashing in the sun, their pilots expecting another easy series of kills. In the split second before combat, the Luftwaffe tactics that had proved so deadly over Poland, Norway, and the Low Countries seemed poised to work yet again. They dove from above and behind, aligning themselves with mechanical precision. But as soon as they committed to their attack runs, the flaw in their assumptions revealed itself. The Defiants did not scatter, they did not dive away, they held steady because they didn't need to face the enemy to fight them. The turret gunners opened fire, the 4.303 Browning guns blazing in controlled arcs. German pilots watched in shock as tracers lanced out from the very angles they believed were safe. Fighters peeled away in confusion, some never made it out. In minutes, the sky over Dunkirk transformed. The useless plane, slow, misunderstood, and dismissed even by parts of the RAF, was suddenly carving through formations with brutal efficiency. Luftwaffe pilots, realizing too late what they were up against, had been drawn into a deadly trap created not by superior performance but by unfamiliar design. Years of doctrinal habit had convinced them that the rear quarter of a British fighter was the safest place to attack. Now it was the most dangerous. For the Defiant crews, the rhythm of battle was unlike anything experienced in single-seat fighters. The pilot felt the aircraft vibrate with the gunner's fire, adjusting course to keep the attacker within the rotating field of fire. The gunner, cut off by the turret walls from almost everything except his targeting view, read the sky in fragments, shapes, flashes, glints of the streak of an enemy passing across his sights. Their teamwork compressed into seconds, the pilot to maximize the gunner's angle, the gunner firing short, precise bursts disciplined by training and necessity. A Defiant could not waste ammunition. Its entire combat load vanished in under a minute of continuous firing. The gunners fired only when sure. What happened next entered RAF legend. Several waves of German fighters were torn apart in rapid succession, their pilots unable to adapt mid-engagement to a threat they did not fully understand. The Defiants exploited the moment perfectly, fighting in tight defensive orbits where each turret could cover the blind spots of the others. The Luftwaffe, temporarily bewildered, lost aircraft in numbers that shocked even the RAF observers on the coast. For a brief but unforgettable moment, the Defiant dominated the sky, not through speed or agility or the familiar virtues of fighter combat, but through the unorthodox practicality of a design nearly everyone had underestimated. Yet even as the Defiants returned to base that day, their crews exhilarated and stunned in equal measure. Limitations of the aircraft were already beginning to surface. The victories over Dunkirk had been real, but they had also been facilitated by surprise, misidentification, and doctrinal rigidity on the part of the Luftwaffe. As news of the losses spread, German pilots adapted rapidly. The window of advantage was narrowing by the hour. Still, the fact remained. On that morning, the plane thought to be a liability had become a Luftwaffe nightmare. It had done so not through design brilliance, but through the brutal improvisation of war, a reminder that under the right circumstances, even flawed machines can become fearsome weapons. And as June 1940 approached, and the Battle of Britain loomed, the Defiant story was only just beginning, shaped by the tension between its unexpected potential and the harsh realities it would soon confront. Its crews, for the moment when the enemy would return, no longer confused, but determined to exploit every weakness they had observed. Determined not to be surprised again, and already adjusting their tactics in ways that would test the Defiant's limits far more brutally than anything encountered over Dunkirk. 6:47 hours, 31 May 1940. The morning air over southern England was calmer than the days before, the channel below appearing deceptively peaceful. But inside RAF sector control rooms, the atmosphere was tightening. Reports from France confirmed what intelligence officers had feared. German fighter units were studying the Defiant carefully. Reconnaissance photographs, pilot debriefs, and wreckage analysis were already circulating through Luftwaffe channels. The illusion that had protected the turret fighter for those first deadly encounters was fading. Within fighter command, opinions about the Defiant were sharply divided. On paper, its early combat record looked extraordinary. Squadrons flying it had claimed impressive numbers of enemy aircraft in a remarkably short period, but operational commanders understood how fragile that success might be. The Defiant's lack of forward-firing guns meant it could not dictate an engagement. It had to be attacked to be effective. And once the enemy understood that the safest approach was from directly ahead or below, the aircraft's vulnerabilities would be brutally exposed. The Defiant had been conceived during a period when the RAF still expected bomber formations to be the primary aerial threat. The logic behind the turret fighter was simple, and in its way elegant. Bombers were large, relatively slow, and predictable. A turret-mounted gunner could track them far more effectively than a fixed forward gun limited by the aircraft's nose. In theory, a formation of Defiants could orbit a bomber stream, pouring sustained fire into its vulnerable arcs while remaining outside the bomber's own defensive coverage. What the designers had not anticipated was how quickly fighter versus fighter combat would come to dominate the skies over Britain. By early June, German fighter leaders had issued new instructions. 109 pilots were ordered to avoid tailing attacks against Defiants at all costs. Instead, they were to engage from the front quarter, where the turret could not traverse far enough forward to bring its guns to bear. The 110, already struggling to survive against nimble RAF single-seat fighters, was directed to disengage entirely unless operating with escort. The Luftwaffe's learning curve was steep and deadly. The shift in tactics became apparent almost immediately. Defiant crews returning from patrols reported near misses from head-on passes, tracers streaking past their canopies in blinding flashes. In those moments, the Defiant was almost helpless. The pilot could roll and dive, but he could not answer the attack directly. The gunner, sealed behind him, watched enemy aircraft flash through arcs his turret simply could not reach. The balance of power was beginning to swing. Yet despite these growing dangers, Fighter Command continued to deploy the Defiant aggressively. The aircraft filled a numerical gap at a moment when every available fighter was needed. Britain's industrial base, though mobilizing rapidly, could not yet replace losses at the rate combat demanded. Hurricanes and Spitfires were precious, Defiants, though flawed, were available, and there was still one role in which the turret fighter showed promise, if employed with extreme discipline and tactical restraint. During the first weeks of June, Defiant squadrons were increasingly assigned to fly in mixed formations or under strict instructions to avoid lone patrols. When supported by Hurricanes or Spitfires, the Defiant could act as a kind of aerial trap. Enemy fighters focusing on the turret aircraft exposed themselves to escort fighters diving in from above. Conversely, German pilots concentrating on the escorts risked drifting into the Defiant's firing arcs. It was an uneasy balance, one that demanded exceptional coordination and timing. Training intensified. Defiant pilots drilled relentlessly in formation flying, learning to maintain precise spacing that allowed overlapping turret coverage without collision risk. Gunners practiced tracking fast-moving targets at extreme deflection angles, compensating for the aircraft's limited speed and climb rate. Crews became acutely aware that their survival depended not on individual heroics but on cohesion. A lone Defiant was a liability. A disciplined group could still be lethal. This reality became brutally clear during engagements along the south coast as the Luftwaffe probed Britons. In one clash, Defiant crews encountered German fighters that refused to commit to the familiar rear attacks. Instead, they made slashing passes from multiple angles, forcing the turret fighters into defensive that bled speed and altitude. Losses followed. Aircraft once celebrated for their early victories now failed to return, their crews killed or captured. The RAF could no longer ignore the truth. The Defiant's moment of dominance had been brief. But to label the aircraft a failure would be to misunderstand its place in the evolving air war. The Defiant had revealed a fundamental weakness in Luftwaffe doctrine, the assumption that all enemy fighters conformed to familiar patterns. That shock had bought the RAF time during a critical phase of the Dunkirk evacuation, when every German fighter diverted or destroyed meant lives saved on the beaches below. The turret fighter's contribution, though fleeting, had been strategically significant. As June turned to July and the Battle of Britain began to take shape, the RAF made a difficult decision. The Defiant would be withdrawn from daylight service as a pure fighter. The cost had become too high and the Germans too adept at exploiting its weaknesses. But the aircraft would not be abandoned. Instead, it would be adapted to a role that suited its design far better, and one that would once again bring it into deadly contact with the Luftwaffe. Night fighting was still in its infancy. Britain lacked effective airborne radar, and visual interception in darkness was chaotic and dangerous. Bombers slipped through with alarming regularity, striking cities, ports, and industrial centers. Fighter Command needed platforms that could loiter, absorb damage, and deliver sustained fire when contact was made. The Defiant, with its turret and two-man crew, suddenly made sense again. By late summer 1940, Defiant squadrons were quietly transitioning to night operations. Crews trained to fly by instruments, to coordinate with primitive ground-controlled interception systems, and to spot the faint glimmer of exhaust flames in the dark. The turret gunner, once criticized as an unnecessary complication, now became an asset. When a bomber was located, the Defiant could approach from below or behind, the gunner tracking the target while the pilot held steady, exactly the role the aircraft had been designed for. Losses did not disappear, but the balance shifted. German bomber crews, already strained by long missions and heavy flak, now faced a new threat rising from the darkness. Defiants claimed victories not in spectacular daylight dogfights, but in quiet, lethal encounters where surprise once again the turret fighter. The aircraft that had been mocked as obsolete now found a second life, its reputation reshaped by necessity. Inside the Luftwaffe, assessments of the Defiant evolved. It was no longer dismissed as a curiosity or a misstep. German night bomber crews were briefed on its presence, warned of attacks from unexpected angles. The Defiant had become, if not a dominant force, then an unpredictable one, a quality that always unsettled. For the men who flew it, the experience was bittersweet. They knew their aircraft's limitations better than anyone. They understood that survival depended on flying smart, not bravely, and they carried with them the memory of those first days over Dunkirk, when surprise and discipline had allowed them to achieve what few thought possible. The story of the Defiant was no longer about sudden triumph alone. It was about adaptation, about how an aircraft born from outdated assumptions could still find relevance in a war that rewarded flexibility above all else. And as the night war intensified and the skies over Britain filled with bombers and interceptors alike, the Defiant would continue to play its quiet, often overlooked role, shaping outcomes not through fame, but through persistence. Persistence that rarely made headlines, but steadily altered the balance of the night sky. 23:58 hours, 7 September 1940. London burned beneath a canopy of smoke and drifting embers, the Thames reflecting fires that stretched from docklands to warehouses and rail yards. The first full night of what would become known as the Blitz had begun, and above the city, Luftwaffe bombers moved in staggered streams, their crews confident that darkness still protected them. Searchlights clawed upward, anti-aircraft guns thundered blindly, and in the chaos between light and shadow, RAF night fighters climbed into an environment where visibility was measured in fleeting seconds. Among them were Defiants, no longer paraded as experimental curiosities, no longer burdened by the unrealistic expectations of daylight fighter combat, but reconfigured and retrained for a role that suited their strengths. The transition to night fighting had not been smooth. Early RAF night interceptions were improvised, dangerous, and often ineffective. Without reliable airborne radar, pilots depended on ground controllers who used sound locators, primitive radar plots, and guesswork to vector fighters toward incoming raids. The Defiant crews had to master a new kind of combat, one where patience replaced reflex and silence mattered more than speed. Pilots flew steady, controlled courses, while gunners scanned darkness that swallowed depth perception and distorted movement. Every shadow could be a bomber, or nothing at all. Yet the Defiant's turret, once a liability in daylight, now proved invaluable. A night interception rarely involved the classic tail chase seen in daytime dogfights. Instead, bombers appeared suddenly, crossing through a fighter's path at odd angles, their exhausts glowing faintly red. The turret allowed the gunner to engage without the pilot having to aggressively, reducing the risk of losing visual contact. In these moments, the Defiant became less a fighter in the traditional sense and more a stable firing platform, delivering short, devastating bursts into vulnerable bomber structures. German bomber crews soon noticed the change. Losses that could not be attributed to flak alone began appearing in mission reports. Aircraft returned with unexplained damage to wings and fuselages or failed to return at all. The Luftwaffe's confidence in the safety of night operations began to erode. Though the numbers were still modest compared to daylight battles, each bomber lost represented not only a crew but a strategic asset Germany could ill afford to waste as the air campaign stretched on. Inside RAF command, analysts tracked these results closely. The Defiant was never going to dominate the night war on its own, but it filled a crucial gap at a time when purpose-built night fighters were still under development. Aircraft like the Bristol would eventually take center stage, equipped with radar and armament. Until then, the Defiant provided continuity, a bridge between improvisation and specialization. For the crews, the psychological strain of night operations was immense. Missions lasted hours, flown in near-total darkness with little visual reference beyond instruments and occasional ground fires. The open canopy of the turret exposed gunners to freezing air, oil fumes, and constant vibration. Communication between pilot and gunner was limited, often reduced to brief signals or shouted words over intercoms distorted by engine noise. Yet trust between the two became absolute. Each depended entirely on the other to survive. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe continued refining its response. German bombers began flying higher routes and increasing reliance on radio navigation beams to avoid interception. Fighter escorts, though largely ineffective at night, occasionally attempted to intervene when RAF fighters were detected near bomber streams. The Defiant, never fast, now faced threats it could neither outrun nor outclimb. Survival depended on avoiding prolonged engagements and exploiting surprise. By late 1940, the Defiant's role had stabilized. It was no longer thrust into situations it could not survive. Squadrons flying it became specialists, operating from specific airfields, coordinating closely with ground control, and flying disciplined patrols rather than roaming intercepts. Their successes were measured quietly in operations rooms, and often overshadowed by the more visible battles fought by Spitfires and Hurricanes in daylight. Still, the Defiant's earlier reputation lingered. Luftwaffe intelligence summaries now included references to turret-armed fighters encountered at night, aircraft capable of engaging without obvious. Bomber crews were warned to watch for fighters approaching from below or abeam, positions that had once seemed relatively safe. The Defiant had forced another adjustment, another layer of caution into German planning. As winter closed in, the nature of the air war shifted again. Weather grounded aircraft for days at a time, then unleashed intense bursts of activity when conditions cleared. Defiant crews flew through cloud layers, icing conditions, and navigational uncertainty that pushed early aviation technology to its limits. Losses continued, but so did experience. Each successful interception refined tactics, informed training, and contributed to the gradual maturation of Britain's night network. The Defiant would never fully escape its early label as a useless plane. Even within the RAF, it was often spoken of as a stopgap, a necessary compromise rather than a triumph of design. Yet this overlooked the context in which the aircraft had operated. The Defiant had been thrust into a war evolving than any planner had imagined. It had failed where doctrine had failed, but succeeded where adaptability mattered. By the time newer night fighters entered service in meaningful numbers, the Defiant's days on the front line were numbered. Squadrons began transitioning to other aircraft, and the turret fighter gradually faded from combat operations, but its impact lingered. It had exposed rigid assumptions, disrupted enemy tactics, and provided a critical defensive capability during one of Britain's most vulnerable periods. The Luftwaffe, for its part, moved on. Losses were absorbed, tactics adjusted, and the air campaign continued with relentless pressure. Yet among German, memories of the Defiant persisted, not as a dominant adversary, but as a reminder that unfamiliar threats could be deadly, even when they appeared technically inferior. And in that lesson lay the true significance of the Defiant story. It was not about technological superiority or sustained dominance. It was about timing, context, and the dangerous cost of underestimation. The aircraft that had been mocked, doubted, and nearly discarded had, at critical moments, shaped the air war in ways far disproportionate to its numbers, becoming, briefly but undeniably, a Luftwaffe nightmare. A nightmare not because it rewrote the rules of air combat, but because it punished those who assumed the rules would never change. 2:15 hours, 14 October 1940. Above the blacked-out coastline of eastern England, cloud cover hung low and uneven, reflecting faint glows from cities still burning after weeks of sustained bombing. The night air was thick with moisture, turning instrument readings sluggish and unreliable. A Defiant climbed through the murk, its Merlin engine humming steadily as ground controllers guided it toward a bomber stream detected moments earlier. The pilot adjusted heading by degrees, careful not to lose altitude. Behind him, the gunner leaned forward in the turret, eyes straining to pick shapes from darkness that seemed almost solid. Encounters like this now defined the Defiant's war. Gone were the sudden, chaotic clashes of daylight over Dunkirk. Night fighting demanded restraint and discipline. A pilot who too sharply risked losing contact forever. A gunner who fired too soon revealed the aircraft's position to unseen escorts or anti-aircraft fire. Success came in seconds after long stretches of nothing at all. When contact was made, it was often almost accidental. A bomber crossed the fighter's path at a shallow angle, exhaust flames flickering like distant candles. The Defiant pilot held course, stabilizing the aircraft while the gunner rotated the turret smoothly, compensating for relative motion. There was no dramatic chase, just a brief alignment, a controlled burst, and then the bomber slipping away into darkness, sometimes trailing sparks, sometimes vanishing entirely. Confirmation of a kill often came only days later, through wreckage reports or missing aircraft lists. These engagements were modest in scale but cumulatively important. Each interception forced the Luftwaffe to accept that night operations were no longer unopposed. The psychological effect was disproportionate to the actual numbers involved. Bomber crews, already facing flak and navigation challenges, now carried the additional burden of invisible fighters lurking along their routes. Morale suffered, fatigue increased, errors For the RAF, the Defiant's contribution fed directly into a broader evolution of night air. Tactics refined through Defiant operations informed training manuals and doctrine. Lessons about approach angles, firing discipline, and coordination with ground control were passed along to crews transitioning to newer aircraft. The turret fighter became, in effect, a test platform, its shortcomings highlighting what future night fighters would need, and its successes demonstrating what was possible even with limited technology. The aircraft itself continued to evolve. Minor modifications improved reliability and safety, though they could not overcome the fundamental limitations of speed and climb. Some Defiants were stripped of turrets entirely and converted for target towing or training roles, a tacit that their days were drawing to a close. Others remained on night patrol, flown by crews who knew the aircraft intimately and trusted it within its narrow envelope of effectiveness. The Luftwaffe, adapting as it always had, responded by dispersing bomber streams, varying altitudes, and adjusting navigation tactics. But the cost of sustained bombing in fuel, aircraft, and train crews was mounting. Britain's industrial output continued despite the Blitz, and fighter command, learning than expected, steadily improved its interception rates. The Defiant's presence was one small part of that mosaic, rarely decisive alone, but meaningful in aggregate. As 1941 approached, the air war over Britain entered a new phase. German strategic priorities shifted eastward, and the intensity of night bombing fluctuated. The pressure on RAF night fighters eased, and with it the urgency that had sustained the Defiant's operational relevance. Squadrons were re-equipped, bases reorganized, and the turret fighter gradually receded from the front line. In hindsight, the Defiant's career appeared contradictory. It had been introduced as a solution to one problem and found itself fighting an entirely different war. It had achieved startling success in brief windows, then suffered heavy losses when the enemy adapted. It had been criticized, sidelined, and yet relied upon during moments when alternatives did not exist. Such contradictions were common in a conflict defined by rapid technological change and relentless operational pressure. For the men who flew it, however, the Defiant was never a joke or a footnote. It was a machine they trusted with their lives, flawed but familiar. They learned to exploit its strengths and respect its weaknesses, to fight not as individual aces but as crews bound by coordination and discipline. Their experience challenged the mythology of air combat that celebrated lone heroes and perfect machines. Instead, it highlighted the reality of war as a process of constant adjustment. German assessments after the Battle of Britain reflected this reality. The Defiant was not singled out as a war-winning aircraft, nor was it dismissed outright. It was recognized as a cautionary example, proof that assumptions about enemy capabilities could be dangerous. In a war where every side sought certainty, the Defiant represented uncertainty, an aircraft that easy categorization. Decades later, historians would debate the wisdom of its design. Some would argue that the turret fighter concept was fundamentally flawed from the start, a misreading of modern air combat. Others would point out that Britain's constraints, industrial, financial, and strategic, made such experiments almost inevitable. Both views held truth. What mattered ultimately was not whether the Defiant was a good aircraft in absolute terms, but whether it mattered when it counted. And in the summer and autumn of 1940, it did. The skies over Britain were not saved by any single aircraft, doctrine, or decision. Victory emerged from a complex system: radar, ground control, production lines, pilot training, and yes, imperfect machines pressed into service at critical moments. The Defiant, misunderstood and underestimated, played its part within that system. It forced the Luftwaffe to adapt. It bought time. It exposed complacency. In that sense, the Defiant story mirrors the larger story of the Battle of Britain itself, a struggle not of flawless execution, but of resilience under pressure. An outcome shaped less by brilliance than by the ability to endure, to learn, and to refuse easy defeat. And that is why the aircraft, once dismissed as useless, could, for a time, become something far more troubling to its enemy, a reminder that in war, danger often comes from what is not expected, and survival belongs to those who adapt first. Adapt first, and abandon assumptions before those assumptions become fatal. 5:41 hours, 3 March 1941. A pale winter dawn crept over an RAF airfield still scarred by the previous year's urgency. Frost clung to grass runways, and mechanics moved quietly between parked aircraft, their breath visible in the cold air. Among the Spitfires and Hurricanes stood a dwindling number of Defiants, their silhouettes unmistakable, long fuselages, broad wings, and the now familiar turret rising like a reminder of an idea born before the war truly revealed its nature. By this point, the Defiant's frontline role was already fading, but its story was far from finished. Fighter Command's priorities were changing. The immediate threat of invasion had receded, and German air operations over Britain were no longer sustained at the scale of the Blitz. Attention shifted toward offensive sweeps over occupied Europe, convoy protection and preparation for a long war that would stretch far beyond the English Channel. In this evolving landscape, the Defiant no longer fit easily. It lacked the speed to escort bombers, the climb to intercept high-flying reconnaissance aircraft, and the radar integration that newer night fighters were beginning to carry. Yet the RAF did not discard the aircraft outright. Instead, the Defiant was repurposed, quietly and pragmatically, into roles that capitalized on its remaining strengths. Many were converted into dedicated night fighters for home duties in less threatened sectors. Others became training aircraft, gunners and pilots for the increasingly complex demands of multi-crew combat aviation. In this capacity, the Defiant shaped the RAF in ways that were less visible but no less important. For turret gunners especially, the Defiant provided invaluable experience. The coordination required between pilot and gunner, timing, communication, trust, mirrored the challenges faced by bomber crews flying deep into enemy territory. Men who trained in Defiance carried that discipline forward into other aircraft, contributing to a broader culture of crew integration that became central to RAF operations later in the war. The turret fighter, initially derided as conceptually backward, had unexpectedly helped prepare the RAF for a future defined by teamwork rather than individual dogfighting prowess. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe's perception of the Defiant continued to evolve as well. By 1941, German pilots rarely encountered the aircraft in daylight, and night interceptions involving Defiants became increasingly infrequent, but the early shock of those encounters lingered in institutional memory. Intelligence assessments noted the RAF's willingness to deploy unconventional solutions and to exploit surprise aggressively. The Defiant was often cited as an example of how underestimating British innovation, even when it appeared misguided, could lead to costly mistakes. This lesson became increasingly relevant as the air war expanded. Over the Eastern Front, North Africa, and eventually the skies of occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe would repeatedly face opponents whose aircraft and tactics did not conform neatly to German expectations. In that broader context, the Defiant's brief moment as a Luftwaffe nightmare took on symbolic weight. It represented the danger of doctrinal rigidity in a conflict defined by rapid change. Within Britain, public awareness of the Defiant remained limited. Wartime censorship and propaganda focused on iconic symbols, the Spitfire's graceful lines, the Hurricane's rugged dependability. The Defiant did not fit the narrative of heroic simplicity. Its story was complex, its successes conditional, its losses uncomfortable, and so it receded into the background of popular memory even as it continued to serve quietly. As the war progressed into 1942 and beyond, surviving Defiants were increasingly relegated to secondary duties. Some were modified for target towing, their turrets removed to reduce weight and complexity. Others were assigned to air-sea rescue training or gunnery instruction. By the time Allied air power shifted decisively towards strategic bombing and long-range escort missions, the Defiant belonged unmistakably to an earlier phase of the war. Yet historians would later argue that judging the aircraft solely by its ultimate obsolescence missed the point. Many wartime designs followed similar trajectories, conceived for one purpose, tested in another, and adapted under pressure until newer solutions replaced them. What set the Defiant apart was how starkly it demonstrated the gap between expectation and reality, and how dramatically that gap could be exploited, even if only briefly. The Defiant's early successes over Dunkirk and southern England were not accidents. They were the product of careful training, disciplined execution, and a willingness to embrace a role no other aircraft could fill at that moment. The Luftwaffe's losses were real, documented, and influential. They forced tactical revisions, reshaped engagement patterns, and contributed to the larger defensive effort that kept Britain in the war. For the men who flew against it, the Defiant left an impression precisely because it violated assumptions. It did not behave like a conventional fighter. It did not present familiar angles of attack. And in a war where split-second decisions determined life or death, unfamiliarity could be lethal. That truth remained long after the turret fighter itself faded from the front lines. As the conflict moved on, the RAF's experience with the Defiant informed future design philosophies. Engineers and planners became more cautious about single-purpose concepts, more attentive to adaptability, and more aware of how quickly enemy tactics could evolve. In that sense, the Defiant's legacy extended beyond its combat record. It influenced how Britain thought about air power in a war that demanded constant reinvention. By the time victory in Europe finally arrived in 1945, the Defiant was already a relic. Most had been scrapped, their metal repurposed for a nation rebuilding from years of total war. Only a handful survived in museums and collections, preserved not as symbols of triumph, but as reminders of a moment when necessity forced innovation, and innovation briefly overturned expectation. Looking back, it becomes clear why the Defiant story resists simple. It was neither a triumph nor a failure in isolation. It was a response to uncertainty, pressed into service during one of Britain's darkest hours, and used to maximum effect before its limitations could no longer be ignored. Its moment as a Luftwaffe nightmare was short, but it was real, and it mattered. Because in the end, the Defiant teaches a deeper lesson about warfare itself. Victory is rarely delivered by perfect machines or flawless ideas. It is forged instead by adaptability, by the willingness to exploit surprise, and by the courage of crews who fly whatever they are given into situations no designer could fully anticipate. And for a brief, critical period in 1940, that was enough to turn a plane many had written off into something far more dangerous than anyone expected. That expectations, once shattered, could never be fully rebuilt in the same way again. 22:17 hours, 15 April 1941. Darkness settled over southern England as blackout curtains sealed homes and factories into islands of shadow. Above them, RAF aircraft climbed slowly into the night, guided by ground controllers working with incomplete information, static-filled radio transmissions, and intuition sharpened by months of survival. Among these aircraft were Defiants, no longer celebrated, no longer misunderstood, but still present. Their role had narrowed, yet their contribution continued in quieter, less dramatic ways that rarely made headlines. By this stage of the war, the air conflict had matured into something colder and more systematic. Radar stations along the coast fed data into command centers where plots were marked with grease pencils and moved across large tables. The Defiant, lacking radar, was already falling behind the technological curve, but it still filled gaps where newer aircraft were unavailable. Crews flew knowing that their aircraft was not the future, but also knowing that the present still demanded them. These night sorties were rarely glorious. Interceptions were difficult, often fruitless. Pilots strained to spot exhaust flames against the black sky, while gunners scanned blindly, knowing that their turret, once a weapon of surprise, was now more a liability than an advantage. Losses mounted slowly, quietly, without the sharp shock that had accompanied the daylight battles of the previous year. And yet, through this phase, the Defiant continued to absorb experience for the RAF, buying time for better solutions to arrive. Those solutions came in the form of radar-equipped night fighters, improved coordination between ground control and airborne crews, and aircraft designed from the outset for nocturnal combat. The Bristol and later the Mosquito lessons learned at high cost, including lessons written in the operational history of the Defiant. The turret fighter had not been the answer, but it had been part of the process that led to one. In Germany, the Luftwaffe's own evolution reflected a parallel struggle. The failure to destroy fighter command in 1940 forced a strategic shift toward bombing cities, then later toward defending the Reich itself. Resources were diverted, doctrines revised, and aircraft designs hurried into production. In these internal debates, the memory of early surprises, like those inflicted by the Defiant, served as cautionary examples. Overconfidence, once exposed, was harder to indulge. The German air arm had entered the war expecting clarity, superior pilots, superior machines, superior tactics. What it encountered instead was an opponent willing to deploy imperfect tools creatively, exploiting timing, terrain, and psychology. The Defiant episode underscored this reality. It showed that even a flawed aircraft could become dangerous if it arrived at the right moment, flown by crews who understood exactly how to use its narrow advantages. For the men of the RAF who flew Defiance in 1940, survival itself became a form of testimony. Their after-action reports, training notes, and tactical feedback fed into a growing institutional memory. They described not only what worked, but why it worked, and why it stopped working. This analytical culture, sharpened by necessity, became one of Britain's quiet strengths as the war expanded into a global struggle. Long after the last Defiant had left operational service, its reputation remained unsettled. Aviation historians debated whether it was a misstep or an inevitability, a relic of thinking or a reasonable gamble based on the information available at the time. The truth lay somewhere in between. The Defiant was conceived for a war that never fully materialized, yet it fought decisively in the war that did. Its moment of relevance was narrow, but it intersected with history at a critical juncture. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone, its survival uncertain, its resources stretched thin. Every aircraft mattered, every engagement mattered, and in that context, the Defiant's unexpected lethality contributed to a broader defensive mosaic that denied Germany the quick victory it sought. This is why the aircraft became, briefly and unexpectedly, a Luftwaffe nightmare, not because it was superior in a conventional sense, but because it disrupted assumptions at precisely the wrong time. German pilots learned, sometimes fatally, that not every RAF fighter behaved according to familiar rules, that hesitation measured in seconds could decide outcomes. As the years passed and newer legends took center stage, the Defiant slipped into obscurity. It lacked the elegance of the Spitfire, the brute resilience of the Hurricane, the technological sophistication of later fighters. But history does not measure significance by aesthetics or longevity alone. It measures it by impact at decisive moments. Today, preserved examples of the Defiant sit quietly in museums, their turrets frozen, their paint restored, their engines silent. They do not tell their story loudly. That story must be read in combat reports, casualty lists, and the shifting tactics of 1940. It must be understood in the context of fear, urgency, and adaptation. Because the Defiant was never meant to dominate the skies. It was meant to solve a problem, and for a brief, dangerous window it did. It forced the Luftwaffe to rethink, to adjust, and to respect an enemy they had underestimated. And in doing so, it earned a place in the deeper history of the air war, a reminder that in World War II, even a useless plane could become decisive, if only for a moment when everything hung in the balance. 11:03 hours, 8 May 1945. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the legacy of the air war was already being sorted into myths, icons, and footnotes. Victory in Europe did not arrive with a single revelation, but with the slow accumulation of lessons learned at immense cost. Among those lessons was an uncomfortable truth for all combatants: wars are not won solely by perfect designs or flawless doctrines, but by how quickly institutions and individuals adapt when reality tears those doctrines apart. In that accounting, the Defiant occupies a narrow but unmistakable place. By the war's end, the Luftwaffe lay exhausted and fragmented, its early confidence destroyed by years of attrition, industrial imbalance, and strategic overreach. German air power had failed not because its pilots lacked skill or courage, but because the assumptions that underpinned its early successes proved brittle. The Defiant story, though small in scale compared to the vast bombing campaigns and decisive air battles that followed, foreshadowed that collapse. It was one of the first signs that the Luftwaffe's certainty could be exploited. In British post-war assessments, the Defiant was rarely celebrated. Official histories mentioned it briefly, often with caveats and qualifications. It was described as an aircraft overtaken by events, a concept rendered obsolete by rapid technological change. And yet, buried in those same documents were that its early combat record had exceeded expectations at a moment when expectations themselves were dangerously low. The men who flew and fought in Defiance returned to civilian life with little public recognition. Their experiences were absorbed into the broader narrative of the Battle of Britain, overshadowed by more famous aircraft and aces. But among aircrew circles, the memory endured. They remembered the shock on enemy formations, the sudden reversals, the fleeting advantage wrested from surprise. They remembered how quickly that advantage vanished once the enemy learned, and how unforgiving the sky became after that. This duality defines the Defiant's place in history. It was neither miracle weapon nor tragic folly. It was a calculated risk taken under imperfect information, deployed in desperation, and used with discipline until its limitations became impossible to ignore. That is not failure. That is war stripped of romance. The Luftwaffe's nightmare was not the aircraft itself, but what it represented. It represented an enemy that could not be easily categorized, an enemy willing to field unconventional solutions, accept losses, and learn than expected. The Defiant disrupted German tempo at a critical moment, forcing tactical revisions when Germany could least afford distraction. In warfare, even brief disruptions can echo far beyond their immediate effects. Modern historians now view the Defiant as a transitional, bridging an era when air combat was imagined as orderly and predictable, and the reality in which chaos, technology, and human adaptation ruled. Its turret, once a symbol of outdated thinking, became a reminder that innovation is often born from fear rather than foresight. Britain did not build the Defiant because it knew exactly how the next war would be fought. It built it because it did not. And that uncertainty, paradoxically, became a strength. When the Defiant failed, Britain adjusted. When it succeeded, Britain exploited the success without illusion. This willingness to revise, discard, and rebuild under pressure contrasted sharply with the rigidity that increasingly constrained German air doctrine as the war progressed. In museums today, visitors stand beneath the Defiant's broad wings and stare at its turret with curiosity. Sometimes, it does not inspire instant admiration. It demands explanation, and in that demand lies its importance. The aircraft forces us to confront how close Britain came to defeat, how thin the margin was, and how survival depended on using every available tool, however imperfect. Because history is not shaped only by the machines that endure, but by those that arrive at exactly the right moment, perform exactly what is required, and then step aside. The Defiant did not win the war. It did not redefine air combat. But in the summer of 1940, when Britain needed time more than perfection, it helped buy that time. And for a brief, dangerous window in the skies over southern England, that was enough to turn a dismissed aircraft into something the Luftwaffe could not afford to ignore. A reminder that in World War II, the line between useless and decisive was often measured not in years or designs, but in moments.